So far this year, we've talked about different parts of a cell and what they do, different processes like photosynthesis or cellular respiration, mitosis, and things like that. I want to take just a few minutes to go over two specific types of cells that are quite often discussed in the news. We'll talk about cancer cells, which are not so good, and stem cells, which can have a very positive impact. Here you see the two learning targets that we'll be touching on. One of them does still have to do with the cell cycle, but what happens when it goes out of control, and that would be when we're talking about cancer cells. And the state also wants us to make sure we can analyze the pros and cons of stem cell usage. So the cell cycle is controlled by enzymes, just like everything else. There are certain checkpoints along the way, and you can see them all labeled here, of when the cell's going to stop and make sure everything looks like it's right before the cell continues to divide. You've got one that's for S phase entry, so that one happens during interphase. You've got a mitosis exit one and a mitosis entry one. And each time you see kind of the questions that the cell is asking. Is it ready to go on? Does it have all this stuff? As long as the cell passes the checkpoints all the way through, you can see that some cells are going to have to divide more frequently than others. Your intestinal cells and skin cells, they reproduce, they go through mitosis quite often, especially your intestinal cells, because the whole lining kind of is being scraped almost on a daily basis. If you look down through there, you can see sperm will live for 2 months, and your red blood cells last for about 4 months. Liver cells last about a year, and remember, your nerve cells may or may not, usually do not, divide at all during mitosis. You're usually born with a maximum number of brain cells you're going to have. That's what you have for your whole life to live with. Students often want to know exactly how long each phase lasts, and it's hard to say because that varies from cell to cell and situation to situation. Here you can see just a normal human cell on the left-hand side. You see that it spends most of its time in interphase. You've got the G1, S, and G2 as being parts of your interphase, and then mitosis just takes up a little tiny portion of that. But if you look on the right-hand side, you see yeast can go through reproduction two different ways. You can do fission or budding, and it varies how long they're going to spend in each stage. Your G2 phase is the longest for yeast that are going through fission, but if you look at yeast going through budding, they don't even go through the G2 phase. They skip right into the mitosis. So it varies from cell to cell and situation to situation. As cells are going through those checkpoints that I showed you, usually if there's a bad cell that's found, your body does something called apoptosis, and it kills off the cell so that those bad cells that aren't doing things properly don't get reproduced. However, especially as you get older, your body may occasionally miss one of those bad cells and allow it to be able to go on to the next phase. And this is where cancer can come in. Cancer is defined just as an uncontrolled growth of cells because they lose their ability to divide normally. This just shows you some facts about cancer. This happens to be based in 2017, but the numbers don't change drastically from year to year. You can see on the left-hand side your new cancer cases that are being reported, and on the right-hand side you see the number of deaths. That actually is, they're given to you in percentages also so that you can see just because it's the most diagnosed doesn't necessarily mean it's the most deadly. This information is all just FYI. You do not need to memorize any of it. I'm now going to have a short video on cancer cells play for you. And as you're watching that video, I want you to take notes on your own paper. Those notes will come in very handy because at the very end of the video, you're going to be asked to actually type in a summary. Here on the Edpuzzle app that you're using, you'll type in your summary. The summary that you're going to type needs to make sure it includes certain things. Your first paragraph will have to do with normal cell division. You'll talk about DNA mutations and causes of cancer. The second paragraph is going to have to do with cancerous cells and how they spread throughout the body. Now, all the information you put in the summary should come strictly from the video that you're watching. So that's why I want you to make sure as you watch it that you do write down some quick notes to yourself so that you can type that summary at the end.
Hi, it's Mr. Anderson. Over 1 million people every year develop cancer. There are over 100 different types of cancer, but many people don't really know what is cancer. And the answer to that question is very simple. If we look at a normal cell, on the inside of the cell is the nuclei, and that contains DNA. And the DNA contains genes that control the actions of the cell. And one of those important actions is how a cell makes a copy of itself, how it goes through what we call the cell cycle. And so if you take a normal cell and put it in culture, it will simply make a copy of itself. And if there's room, those cells will make copies of themselves, and they'll keep doing that until they fill up that area. And if one of these cells dies, then an adjacent cell is going to jump into that cell cycle, and it's going to fill that hole. And so that's how you went from a zygote to the trillions of cells that are inside your body. And that's also how you replace cells. And so your skin is constantly losing cells off the surface, but we're creating cells underneath that. And so the cause of all cancers is the same. There's going to be damage to the DNA. And so that DNA is made up of what are called nucleotides. And there are tons of genes in there that are controlling this cell cycle, when a cell should make a copy of itself and when it should stop dividing. And so a mutation is simply damage to that DNA. Now, it could just occur spontaneously. If we all live long enough, we're all going to develop cancer because these mutations are going to start to accrue during our lifetime. But we can also increase the rate of those mutations using the environment. And so, for example, if we smoke cigarettes, that could cause mutations to the DNA. Increases in UV radiation, we're finding that decreases in exercise, increases in certain types of diet can cause mutations, and that can cause problems in the cell cycle. And so let's say we get a mutation in this cell right here. There are going to be genes within that cell that sense something is wrong, and lots of times it'll undergo apoptosis where that cell dies and another cell moves inside. But during our lifetime, we start to accrue more and more mutations, and eventually enough mutations build up in one of those cells, and it becomes not a normal cell, but a cancerous cell. And this takes a long time for that to occur. And so this is a pretty awful graph. This is the increase in the popularity of cigarettes. And so this is the number of cigarette smoking per person per year. And so as they were doing that, they were increasing the mutations inside their body. And we can look decades later, we see the causation. We can see an increase in lung cancer in men as well. And so as we make those mistakes in our cell, we form these cancerous cells. Now, what does a cancerous cell do? It doesn't matter that there's cells around it. It's simply going to divide and divide and divide over and over and over again. And eventually what you create is a tumor. Now, there are two types of tumor. If those cells are restricted to that one area and stay within a membrane, we call those benign tumors, and that's not cancer. But if there is no restriction to that area, it becomes what's called a malignant tumor. And that's really a definition of what cancer is. It's when we have these uncontrolled cell growth and those cells that show uncontrolled cell growth spreading throughout our body. And so this is a video of some cancerous cells. And so instead of just growing and doing the jobs of the cell, you can see they're kind of misshapen. And all they do is make copies of themselves and copies of themselves over and over and over again. That's where all the energy is going. Now, if that was restricted to one area, it wouldn't be as big a deal, but they can move to different areas of the body. And so if we have a tumor right here, it can start to invade the tissues around it. And so that tumor can not only get larger, but can move into new areas. And if that tumor gets into the lymphatic system or the circulatory system, it can move around our body and it can settle somewhere else. And so that's the problem with a malignant tumor. And so we name cancers based on the tissues and the organs that they infect. So this would be lung cancer, but we could also have colon cancer or maybe a pancreatic cancer or breast cancer. It's basically named on the tissue of where it is. Now, each of those cancers, even though the cause is the same, damage to the DNA, which produces uncontrolled cell growth, the way they manifest the disease is going to be totally different. And so
Another type of cells that we hear in the news all the time are stem cells. And stem cells are still being experimented with, but they are unspecialized cells that can develop into specialized cells when they undergo the right conditions. Most of our cells in our body, our muscle cells, our blood cells, our nerve cells, they have their own shape. They have the same DNA in each of them, but different DNA genes turned on in each of them. So they have their own function to do, which gives them their own shape and, of course, their own location. Each of those cells is specialized. Your stem cells which is what we had when you were a little tiny little embryo in your mom's belly. You were made of stem cells that were they were unspecialized. They did not know what they were going to be yet, and they could develop into any type of cell. Those stem cells are what we're going to be talking about. Just like with the cancer cells, I'm going to have you write a quick summary of your stem cell video that you're about to watch also. This guy does talk a little fast, so I am going to allow you, if you need to do a little bit of research on the internet, you're welcome to. But I don't want you to spend too much time researching this at this point in time. I hope to come back and we'll spend more time on stem cells later. The summary this time, your first paragraph needs to answer these questions. What are stem cells? Where do they come from? And how are they used? And your second paragraph is completely your own personal opinion. There is no right or wrong answer, but how do you feel about stem cell research? What are the pros, the cons? Do you think we should or should not do it, and why?
Hey there, welcome to Life Noggin. Over the course of human history, medicine has come quite a long way. Centuries ago, we thought the body was composed of different liquids called humors, and if you were unlucky enough to get sick during this time, your blood would have been withdrawn in a process known as bloodletting. Gross. In modern times, we can give antibiotics, perform open heart surgery, and even operate on the brain. However, one of the newest advances in medicine is stem cell research. You may have heard of stem cells before, but there's a lot of mystery about what they actually do. Why is this such a promising new field? Well, to answer this, let's shrink down to the size of a cell. Normal cells in the body are specialized. We have neurons in the brain, red blood cells in our blood, and cells that make up your muscles and bones. All of these cells carry the same DNA, which is unique to you, unless you're an identical twin. But what makes the cells different is that some of them have certain genes turned either on or off. The genes are encoded in the DNA, which is all the same, but the gene expression is different. This means that the genes expressed in a red blood cell are different than the genes expressed in a lung cell. And that lung cell will always stay a lung cell. It will not change into a red blood cell one day. However, stem cells can. Stem cells are unspecialized cells that give rise to specialized cells in a process called differentiation. When a stem cell divides, the new cells can either remain as stem cells or become other cells with a specialized function, like muscle cells. There's a lot of cell talk, but we're going to keep going. There are two main types of stem cells, those found in adults and those found in embryos. Somatic or adult stem cells can be used to repair and maintain the tissues in which they are found. These can be found in the brain, skin, and bone marrow. In fact, during a bone marrow transplant, stem cells are injected into a patient whose bone marrow was damaged somehow. The unspecialized stem cells then create new bone marrow, allowing for the body to produce healthy blood cells again. Stem cells can also be used for organ and tissue regeneration. If the cells differentiate in just the right way, they can act as a renewable source of replacement cells. For example, stem cells beneath the skin can be used to make skin grafts for burn victims. And this could eliminate our reliance on organ donation and make the wait list for transplants a lot shorter. Stem cells also have the potential to replace damaged brain tissue, treating diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Furthermore, embryonic stem cells can differentiate and form insulin-producing cells that can treat people with type 1 diabetes. And the list of treatments goes on and on and on. The main controversy with stem cells, however, involves those taken from embryos. It's important to note that these cells are not obtained from fertilized eggs in a woman's body. Instead, they are gathered from eggs in an in vitro fertilization clinic. These are the eggs that were not implanted in a mother's uterus and were willingly donated for research purposes. But this does beg the question of whether or not a life was destroyed in the process, which ultimately leads to the debate. The use of stem cells are seemingly endless, and we've come a long way since our humble beginnings, and will hopefully continue to advance. So tell me, have you had any experience with stem cells or organ donation? Or maybe you know someone who has? I'd love to hear your or their story. And if
Because that video was so fast, I do have a few extra slides in here for you to be able to use as reference if you would like to. So there is this one, and there is this one also if you would like to use either of these to help you write your summary. Just go forward, backwards, and pause as needed. Hopefully this video has helped you improve your knowledge on cancer cells, and how sometimes cells can start to divide uncontrollably and the problems that can cause. Also, hopefully you've learned a little bit more about stem cells and advantages or disadvantages that they may have being used in the medical field. Lots of pros and cons on both sides, and a lot of ethical debate still surrounding stem cell usage.